Dr. Amara Collins had barely finished her shift when the call came in urgent room 913, top floor of the private recovery wing. The one most residents whispered about but never entered unless escorted. The one reserved for the patients with seven-figure bank accounts and million-dollar complications, and despite the exhaustion clinging to her every limb after a 14-hour non-stop rotation through the ER and surgical wing, something in the nurse's voice compelled her not to question the request, not to pass it off to another doctor, not to delay, and so she pressed the elevator button with hands that still smelled faintly of antiseptic and latex, her dark curls damp with sweat under her cap, her sneakers worn thin from hours of pacing trauma hallways, but her heart steady, her mind focused, her oath fresh in her soul. And when the elevator dinged open, revealing the gold-toned corridor with velvet carpet and brass-framed artwork, she knew this was not about a standard patient but someone with power, someone important, someone who had, until 3 months ago, owned half the skyline in this city. Eleanor Wyndham, reclusive real estate tycoon, former ballet dancer, philanthropist, and heir to one of the oldest oil fortunes in North America, now silent, unmoving, in a coma induced by a mysterious fall in her penthouse. A woman whose name still commanded entire boardrooms to fall quiet, whose signature on a check could alter the future of entire neighborhoods. And yet here she was, lying frail and ghost-like beneath the crisp white sheets of a private ICU bed, with tubes in her arms, machines humming softly, and not a single family member at her side, just a tabby cat figurine on the windowsill, a fresh bouquet rotated daily by someone unknown, and a silver locket resting on her chest over the hospital gown. And as Dr. Amara entered the room with her clipboard in one hand and a tray of bandage supplies in the other, she felt a strange hush wash over her, not of fear but of deep ancestral reverence, the kind that comes when one's soul recognizes the fragile thread that binds all of us, rich or poor, black or white, powerful or powerless, to the same final truth that life hangs on the whisper of breath and the tender hands of those who serve. So she approached with care, gently removing the old gauze from Eleanor's shoulder where a jagged wound from her fall had stubbornly resisted healing. Her fingers delicate, her voice soft as she spoke to the unconscious woman, not because she had to, but because she always did, always believed somewhere, somehow, they heard it. And as she peeled back the layers of soaked bandage, she noticed something odd. The skin beneath was not necrotic as the chart had indicated yesterday, but pinker, warmer, and healing faster than expected. So she leaned in, touched the edge of the wound with gloved fingers, and as she did, a faint twitch ran across the woman's lips, almost imperceptible, but real enough to freeze Amara mid, real enough to make her glance at the monitors to see if something had spiked. But the lines were steady, the machines calm, yet Eleanor's hand suddenly jerked ever so slightly, as though testing gravity, then fell still again, and Amara, her heart thudding with something between disbelief and instinct, leaned closer, whispering, "Ms. Wyndham, can you hear me?" And though the silence returned, she swore she saw a flicker in those long-closed eyelids, like a dream trying to rise to the surface. And for a moment, Amara forgot the hospital politics, forgot the color of her coat and the assumptions made when she wore it, forgot that she was the youngest attending physician in the building and the only black one on this floor, forgot the looks, the whispers, the way her brilliance was often downplayed and her compassion mistaken for naivety. Because here, in this quiet room, something impossible was happening, something no specialist had been able to trigger in months of scans, drugs, and consultations. Something was changing. And as she finished replacing the bandage and stood back to document the procedure, she felt it again, that inexplicable shift in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm cracks the sky. And as she stepped into the hallway to report the incident, her fingers hovering over the call button for neurology, a nurse burst around the corner breathless, shouting, "Dr. Collins, you're needed back in 913 now." And Amara turned on her heel and ran, her pulse racing, her mind blazing. Because somewhere behind that door, a billionaire was about to wake up, and everything Amara thought she knew about medicine, fate, and her place in this world was about to change forever. The door to room 913 flew open with the urgency of a tidal wave crashing against a forgotten shore, and Dr. Amara Collins barely had time to process the frantic voice of the nurse who'd summoned her, before she was swallowed once more into the quiet storm that had begun in the sterile stillness of Eleanor Wyndham's suite, a room where time had long stood still, where heartbeats came measured and mechanical, where voices were low and hope even lower. And yet now everything was different. Because as Amara crossed the threshold, she saw what no one else had seen in over 92 days. Eleanor's eyes were open, wide, glassy, blinking with confusion and tremors of awareness, flickering like a candle that had survived the wind. And the woman whose name had once headlined financial magazines and city plaques was lying there, pale but unmistakably conscious, her head shifting fractionally on the pillow as though the effort cost mountains, her lips dry and twitching. And in that moment, Amara didn't care about protocol or the blinking red lights above the monitors or the cluster of techs fumbling with wires in the corner, because she knew that it hadn't been coincidence, that something deep in that tender act of changing the bandage, of touching the wound not as a chore but as a sacred duty, had reached through the fog of Eleanor's coma and pulled her back, and as she stepped to the bedside and gently lowered her face to Eleanor's line of sight, she spoke again in that same soft voice. "Ms. Wyndham, it's me, Dr. Collins. You're safe. You've been asleep for some time, but you're back now." And Eleanor blinked once slowly, deliberately, as a single tear rolled from the corner of her eye. And though her throat couldn't yet form sound, her lips shaped something resembling a name, Mar.Tha, or maybe Mar.Ri. But Amara didn't need clarity yet, only certainty. And as nurses scrambled to call neurology, and administrators were suddenly alerted, and somewhere, a hospital lawyer was no doubt being roused from bed to prepare for whatever this meant, Amara stood firm at the foot of the bed, stunned yet steady, watching as Eleanor's fingers moved like stiff wires regaining current, twitching, flexing, remembering, and for a moment, the billionaire's eyes locked with hers, brown into blue, and there was recognition, not of identity perhaps, but of spirit, a silent understanding that the world had changed, and this moment, improbable as it was, mattered more than anyone could yet realize. And by the time the specialists arrived, suits and lab coats, clipboard titans, neurologists with grand reputations and practiced out, Amara was already fielding questions, with a calm that belied the tempest inside her, reciting vitals, motor responses, eye movements, speech attempts, everything Eleanor had displayed since awakening, while in the back of her mind raced the impossible question, why now, why her? And as the team hovered around Eleanor with flashlights and tongue depressors and hushed assessments, Amara noticed something. Eleanor's gaze kept drifting back to her, not to the seasoned heads of neurology or the chief of staff now suddenly interested in this miracle case, but to the young black woman who had treated her not like a myth or a transaction but like a soul fighting its way back. And it wasn't long before the press caught scent of the story. Whispers among staff leaked. Rumors spread through the upper halls like wildfire, and by the next morning headlines were speculating across digital news feeds. Sleeping heiress awakes, mystery of Eleanor Wyndham's recovery. Angel hands doctor at center of miracle. And Amara, whose name had rarely graced anything beyond an internal commendation or quiet thank you from a colleague, now found herself being questioned, filmed, scheduled into back-to-back interviews she never asked for. But even in the midst of this whirlwind, all she could think about was Eleanor, the woman still learning how to breathe again without the machine, whose lips were gaining strength, whose hands now formed weak but purposeful gestures, who tried each day to speak, and when she finally croaked out her first full sentence 3 days later, it wasn't a cry for family or fortune but 3 strangled words that made Amara freeze in place. Where ... is Malcolm? And nobody in the room seemed to know who Malcolm was, none of the nurses, not even the staff who had managed her case since day one. But Amara felt a strange chill ripple through her spine, not from fear but from the weight of something hidden, something unspoken. And when she asked softly, "Malcolm who?" Eleanor's eyes darkened, filled with a grief so sharp it sliced through the sterile air like a scalpel, and she turned her head away, closing her eyes again as though to shield herself from a truth too painful to name. And in that moment, Amara knew this was not just a medical recovery, it was a resurrection tied to secrets, to memory, to a life interrupted by something darker than a mere fall. And as Eleanor drifted back into a light but conscious sleep, Amara stood there quietly, unsure what haunted this woman's return to the waking world, but certain of one thing: the truth would surface, and somehow, she was now part of it. The days that followed Eleanor Wyndham's awakening unfolded like pages in a book that someone once tried to burn, charred at the edges, heavy with secrets, and dripping with the weight of a truth too long buried. And while the world outside celebrated what they called a miracle, dubbing it everything from divine intervention to medical marvel, inside the sterile walls of the hospital's elite 9th floor, Amara Collins couldn't shake the tremor in her gut every time Eleanor whispered the name Malcolm in a voice fragile as torn lace, because no one could identify him, not in her official family records, not in the corporate archives of the Wyndham Group, not even in the countless press clippings or society pages from Eleanor's years in the public eye. And yet each time she regained enough strength to speak, Eleanor's voice cracked around the same question: where is Malcolm? Is he safe? And Amara, who had grown up in the projects of Baltimore where names had weight and absence was often more dangerous than presence, recognized the desperation in Eleanor's plea, not as that of a billionaire heiress but of a woman whose soul was still tied to someone the world had erased. And so, late at night, when her shift ended and the hospital corridors fell quiet except for the hum of vending machines and the buzz of halogen lights, Amara began her own investigation, not out of curiosity, but from a growing sense of duty that clawed at her conscience like a wound refusing to close. And she pored over what little personal documentation existed in the hospital's locked patient files, noting that Eleanor had no next of kin listed, no emergency contacts, just a long chain of legal proxies and corporate guardianship handled by the Wyndham Foundation's board. Men in tailored suits who had barely blinked when she went into a coma, and now loomed around the hospital with sudden interest and tight smiles that never reached their eyes. as if her return posed an inconvenience they hadn't planned for. And it was during one of these silent night shifts, while she sat in the hospital archive room lit only by a single flickering desk lamp, that Amara found an old hand letter dated 12 years prior, tucked inside a manila folder, misfiled under Wyndham instead of Wyndham, and in it, Eleanor's unmistakable looping script spoke of a boy named Malcolm, her godson, a child she had taken into her home in secret, after his mother Releno's childhood maid and closest friend had died unexpectedly, a child never formally adopted but raised in the shadows of her penthouse, hidden from public view to shield him from the ruthless scrutiny of the Wyndham board who had opposed his presence, and Amara's heart broke and flared at the same time, reading Eleanor's words soaked in fear and love, her refusal to let the boy be swept away by those who wear wealth like armor and prejudice like blood, and it became suddenly clear that the coma hadn't erased Eleanor's mind, it had frozen her in a moment of terror for someone she loved, someone who may have been threatened, taken, or worse, and that realization hit Amara like a thunderclap. Eleanor hadn't just fallen, someone had wanted her silenced, and now that she was waking up, the danger may not be over. And as Amara walked back into Eleanor's room with that letter pressed close to her chest, she saw the billionaire looking at her not weakly this time, but with intent, as if Eleanor had been waiting for her, not a nurse or a lawyer or a board member, but her, the one who had touched her wounds with both science and spirit. And when Amara sat beside her bed and whispered, "I know about Malcolm," Eleanor's eyes widened, flooded with equal parts hope and fear, and though her vocal cords strained, she managed to rasp, "They came for him," and Amara leaned closer, heart thudding, Who came for him?" But Eleanor only shook her head, a single tear sliding down her temple, her hand trembling as she reached toward the locket on her chest and opened it with stiff fingers to reveal a tiny photo inside, a dark-skinned boy with soft eyes and a smile too wise for his age, standing beside a younger Eleanor in a sun-drenched garden. And Amara understood that Malcolm had not just been a secret, he had been a lifeline, a thread of love kept hidden from a world too cruel to allow it, and now that Eleanor had returned, that thread was unraveling, threatening to pull down everything her enemies had worked so hard to bury. And as Amara stepped out into the hallway, she noticed for the first time a suited man standing near the elevator, not speaking, just watching, eyes like glass, posture too still, and when their gazes met, something passed between them, a silent warning, an unspoken challenge, and Amara knew, right then, she wasn't just a doctor anymore, she was now the keeper of someone's dangerous truth, and whatever came next, she would face it not just as a physician, but as a woman who had pulled a soul from darkness and wouldn't let the world snatch her or her secrets away again. Eleanor Wyndham's eyes opened fully that morning with a clarity Amara Collins had never seen in any patient before, not a flicker of uncertainty, not a hint of the fog that had clung to her voice for days, but a crystalline, sharpened gaze that cut through the stale air of room 913 like a scalpel. And in that moment, Amara realized that Eleanor hadn't just woken up, she had returned not as the fragile heiress the media painted her to be, but as a woman on the edge of revelation, her mind alive with purpose, her breath thick with urgency. And as she gripped Amara's hand with a trembling strength that belied her weeks of stillness, her voice raspy but growing stronger choked out the words that would ignite everything. "I didn't fall. They pushed me, because of Malcolm." And with those 7 syllables, everything Amara feared, suspected, and tried to bury beneath professionalism came surging to the surface in a crashing tide of truth. Because Eleanor hadn't been in a coma, due to an accident or a neurological fluke, she had been silenced, nearly killed, by those who feared the consequences of her love for a boy who was never supposed to exist in her public story. And now that she had awoken, those people, the men in suits with gleaming teeth and velvet threats, the trustees of her empire who had shuffled papers and smiled on camera while secretly cutting off her bloodline, were scrambling to contain the explosion she had become. But what they hadn't counted on was Amara, the young black doctor with no stake in their money or legacy, only in the truth, only in justice. And when Amara stood before the hospital board that afternoon, holding Eleanor's handwritten letter, her medical report documenting signs of a struggle not matching the official fall narrative, and the photographic proof of the locket Eleanor still clutched like armor, she felt a fire rise in her, not born of ego but of ancestry, of generations, who had been told to stay silent, to accept what was given, to not question the powerful, and she refused to let that legacy die in fear. And as the board tried to downplay Eleanor's claims as post-coma delusion, Amara called in the neurologist who had confirmed her cognitive coherence, then the forensic nurse who had long suspected inconsistencies in Eleanor's bruising patterns, and finally Eleanor herself, brought in a wheelchair, dressed in dignity, no longer the sleeping beauty but the awakening storm. And when she faced the men who had once controlled every corner of her empire, her voice didn't shake, didn't crack, it struck, slow and firm. "I was going to sign over full control of the Wyndham Foundation to Malcolm. That's why they tried to erase him. And me." The room fell to ash in her wake. Reporters huddled outside the hospital like wolves hungry for truth, And within days, the truth did come out, not just of Malcolm's existence, but of his disappearance 12 years prior, quietly covered up as a runaway, but in fact orchestrated by Wyndham's then legal counsel, now a hedge fund CEO who'd buried the truth beneath shell companies and non-disclosure agreements. And Amara, using every ounce of visibility she now carried, worked with investigators to unearth surveillance footage, travel logs, and with Eleanor's help, even secured a whistleblower's testimony from a former driver who had dropped Malcolm, offered a secluded boarding school funded by the foundation but never accredited by the state. And when they finally found him grown, now hardened but alive, living under a new name in a rural town, working with at-risk youth just as Eleanor had always hoped, Amara flew with Eleanor in a private ambulance to see him. And when mother and godson saw each other for the first time after a decade of forced silence, no words were needed, only tears and the kind of embrace that resurrects not just people but purpose. And Amara, standing just beyond the doorway, felt herself tremble not from sadness, but from awe, from knowing she had been chosen for this moment, not by chance but by the very thread of history that tied all things together. And as the Wyndham board crumbled under public scrutiny, criminal charges, and Eleanor's new legal power, she appointed Malcolm as the true heir, not just to her fortune, but to her mission, to rebuild what power had destroyed, to protect what had once been hidden, to serve not profits but people. And as for Amara, she declined the interviews, the offers, the limelight, choosing instead to stay at the hospital where she had made history not with headlines but with healing. Though, this time, she didn't walk those hallways invisible anymore. Nurses saluted her, interns quoted her, and patients waited patiently just to feel her hands. Not because of what the world said, but because they knew. She saw them, all of them, even when they were silent, even when they slept. And Eleanor, now fully recovered, never stopped telling anyone who'd listened that her life had been saved not by a machine or a miracle, but by the hands of a young black doctor who didn't just treat her wounds. She listened, she cared, she believed, and that made all the difference. Because when Eleanor Wyndham woke up, she didn't just wake up to a world of tubes and headlines. She woke up to Amara, and in that awakening, the world changed not with an explosion but with a whisper that turned into a roar. Justice lives where compassion dares to speak.